for the reopening guidelines, we're seeing guidelines, it gets very confusing. We're seeing guidelines from the state level, also on the county level, and even down to the city level. And we'll talk about the different ones. You know, here in California, I've got the links to these guidance for hotels, and then a general checklist for hotels and lodging employees. And then also on the county level, we've got, most counties follow this. We've got the protocols cover 5 major areas: workplace policies and practices to protect employee health, physical distancing protocols, infection control, communicating with employees and the public, and then measures to ensure equitable access to critical services. Now, there's a lot of debate whether these are mandatory or recommendations, and it's up to debate on that issue. So employers need to approach it carefully, but I think the major exposure is if you're not following these guidelines and protocols on the state and local levels, it's going to expose you to those lawsuits and those negligence types of claims. So it's important to pay attention, really drill down, see what applies to your city, your county, and on the state level as well. And I've got some links to that in that handout that Craig has too to help guide you through that. Next slide, please. So Los Angeles County gets into, I didn't want to walk through all the protocols on the county level, and I'm sure everybody's reading that already, but I wanted to highlight a few items here out of the protocol. It's a pretty heavy document. There's a lot of pages to it, but generally there's social distancing and symptom check protocols and recommendations, and LA County here is requiring it for employees, vendors, contractors, and other service providers. And it also sets forth that employers need to provide accommodations for vulnerable staff, over 65 years old, pregnant, or with chronic health conditions. And what they're saying here is, look, if you've got these high-risk individuals, work with them, provide accommodations for them if they need additional time off, maybe work from home additional time, things like that. Work with them. And that's been my guidance to clients as well when these issues come up. Just be careful about that. And then have a plan in place for positive cases. This is really important as you're reopening your hotel or related facility. And I do have a checklist. If there's positive case in the workplace, I've got a checklist that Craig can make available to everybody on the call for best practices on that. But generally, the employee, to the extent they've tested positive, have to isolate themselves. And then all employees who had exposure to that employee should self-quarantine themselves. And also put a place into play to test those employees that have been exposed to that. And if anybody has any questions about the testing, I can walk through that too. Post those in the chat. We can talk about that later on. And also, I do have some recommendations too if you need a service to bring in to test employees. I've got some names and numbers I can hand out too if anybody wants that. And then for hotels, the county guidance says if you've got 3 or more known cases within 14 days, it's required to report this to the Department of Public Health for the County of Los Angeles. So keep that in mind too. If you've got a lot of cases, 3 or more showing up, you're going to have to do that. The next slide, please. And then the protocol for LA County, we've got the, sorry, I skipped ahead. I'm looking at 2 different slides. Craig will go back one. Some highlights for the LA County protocol. Yep, the employers need written worksite specific COVID-19 plans. So it's important to walk through and post these. They need to be distributed to all employees. This protocol that the LA County has published, it's easy. You can download it from their website. It needs to be distributed to all employees. I do recommend emailing this out so that there's a copy of that. And the physical distancing requirements for hotels, they did recommend that housekeeping is only done when guests are not present to the extent possible. And in elevators, I thought this was kind of interesting to point out too. For elevators and hotels, it's limited to 4 individuals or a family at a time, and all riders must wear their face covering. And then for facility safety, to the extent possible, they are saying it's recommended to log guests. And we haven't seen this in other industries like restaurants where there's a tracking of guests that have been there. I've seen it some other states, like Washington State have done it for restaurants. But here the County of LA is setting it out to the extent possible. Track your guests, their name, phone number, and email addresses. So if there is an outbreak, there's a way to contact the guests and notify them of it. And then the cleaning and sanitizing, housekeepers are provided personal protective equipment for cleaning. Housekeeping employees provided gloves when removing dirty linen, and then that the dirty linen is placed in single-use sealed bags. So that's the only time we're seeing that gloves are required as part of the process. And there's been a lot of questions about when gloves are required and when they aren't, and some different guidance from the CDC on the federal level and on the state level like this. So pay attention to that. And, especially for, high risk cleaning, and we'll talk about dishwashers too, to the extent you've got any food service workers in the hotel, there's some additional requirements on that too. And again, a copy of the protocol posted in all public entrances to the facility. And then for hotels, guests are also required to be notified of the policies and procedures prior to arriving at the hotel. And this includes being informed that if they have any symptoms, that they can cancel the reservation without any kind of penalty for canceling. And then the County of Los Angeles also does provide examples of signage at the end of the protocol, so you can use those signs around your hotel. So it's very user-friendly. And then LA City, on the city-specific issues, LA City generally mirrors LA County's protocol. Some exceptions to that, though, is LA City wanted a process to log all employees on site. And generally, I think a lot of employers are doing this already by just tracking their time that they've worked. And you generally know which employees are there. But that's in case there's an outbreak. You can go back and see which employees were working with the employee that tested positive, and you can go and contact those employees and tell them to stay home, self-quarantine if necessary, or get them tested if necessary. And then LA City has this 5-day notice and priority of recall for some employees under this ordinance that I have listed there. And it applies to some hotel employers, so it's important to take a look at this ordinance. And in that document I provided to Craig, there's a link to the actual ordinance. But this might apply to some of the people on the webinar today. If you're operating in Los Angeles City, you're going to have to comply with this ordinance on recall and give priority to recall based on seniority for your employees too. It doesn't apply to all employers, but it's important to take a look at that ordinance to see if it applies to you. Now, we get a lot of questions too about positive cases, what to do, and LA City does set out some good detail here about what to do. They've got some passing mention that you have to inform the guests, but then they don't explain it. And within that same sentence or description, excuse me, they talk about informing the employees. So it's not entirely clear what requirement hotel operators have to inform guests if there's a positive case in the hotel. Now, conservatively speaking, I think it's probably safer to be out in front of it, inform guests that you know had contact with any employee that might have had it or did have it, and be thinking ahead. What you don't want to do is be behind the 8 ball and then the media get it, or something like we're seeing on some of these other issues in restaurants. So just stay ahead of it and proactive. And then some pretty typical other requirements about self-testing and making sure that the employees don't have any symptoms coming into work. And then if they have had a positive case, that those employees are not returning into work until they've been tested or enough time's passed. Generally speaking, it's about 14 days, 10 to 14 days, if the employee has been positive and they haven't been tested, that they are clear from symptoms and then can return to work. But it's very touchy on this issue. You need to look at the CDC guidelines on this and when they can return, and on the testing as well. And generally, the CDC requires 2 tests for the employee before the employee can return to work. They have to have 2 negative tests that are 24 hours apart. And then LA City also requires this refresher training course, and it's a good practice overall. to do that on a routine basis. And then also to provide a copy of the safety and health plan to employees and document the receipts. And I would document all of this extremely well from the employer's perspective. That can't hurt. And then if there is a presumptive case in an effective guest room, they have some requirements here in the city level that the room is taken out of order. And then they do recommend that some licensed third party come in and clean that room before another guest use that. And then I've got a link here with some signs for hotel operators to use as well on the city level. Now we're getting a lot of questions about face coverings. When are they required? And how do we regulate guests coming in that aren't wearing their face masks as well? So generally speaking, under California law, employers should be providing the face masks, and the LA County and LA City guidance are requiring these as well. So it's a cost that the employer needs to bear and provide it to the employees. So do that, make sure that they're trained on how to wear it and that they're instructed to clean it daily.